My name is Amara, and before anyone ever called me lucky, before I stepped on a plane, before I ever imagined a life beyond survival, I was just a girl trying to breathe inside a life that felt too heavy for her chest. I was born into a home where struggle wasn't a phase, it was the foundation. Not the kind of struggle people post about. Not the kind that ends with a smile and soft music. I'm talking about the kind that wakes up with you, eats with you, and sleeps beside you like a shadow that never leaves. We didn't have enough. Not enough money, not enough stability, not enough certainty about tomorrow. But somehow, we always had just enough hope to survive the day. My mother, she was everything. Provider, protector, fighter. Her hands told stories her mouth never did, rough, tired, always moving. She carried burdens I didn't fully understand, but I felt them every time she looked at me with both love and worry. Because loving me meant worrying about me. My father, he existed in our lives, but not in the way a father should. Life had taken something from him, maybe pride, maybe strength, and what remained was a man who no longer knew how to stand for his family. So my mother stood for all of us. And I learned early that I had to stand for myself. Childhood didn't feel like childhood. While other kids dreamed, I calculated. If we have this today, will we have food tomorrow? If I ask for this, will it become a burden? So I stopped asking. I became the girl who needed less. The girl who stayed quiet. The girl who watched life instead of participating in it. But deep inside me, something refused to die. A voice. Soft, persistent, almost annoying. This cannot be your whole life. At first, I ignored it. Because hope can be dangerous when your reality keeps proving it wrong. But the voice didn't leave. It grew. Every time I saw students in uniforms walking confidently to school. Every time I heard someone talk about studying abroad. Every time I imagined what it would feel like to live without constant fear of lack. That voice whispered again, there is more. School became my only doorway to something different. Not because it was easy. In fact, it was another battlefield. There were days I went to class hungry. Days I couldn't focus because my mind was still at home, thinking about bills, responsibilities, problems that a child shouldn't carry. But I held on, because education felt like the only thing no one could take from me. I didn't have the best materials. Sometimes I borrowed books. Sometimes I studied from memory. Sometimes I simply listened harder than anyone else. And slowly, something began to change. Teachers started noticing me, not because I spoke the most, but because when I did, I meant it. Not because I had everything, but because I made something out of nothing. That's when I first heard about scholarships. Fully funded, studying abroad, a life beyond borders. It sounded like a story. Not something real, not something meant for girls like me. But that voice inside me, it didn't laugh, it didn't doubt, it simply said, try. I remember the day I decided. There was no big moment. No dramatic music, just a quiet evening. My mother was sitting outside, looking more tired than usual. And for the first time, I didn't just see her as my mother. I saw her as a woman who had given everything, and received very little in return. Something inside me shifted. I realized, if I stayed in the same place, doing the same things, our story would never change. That night, I made a decision that terrified me. I would apply, not because I believed I would succeed, but because I could no longer accept a life where I never tried. And that decision, that small, quiet, almost invisible decision, was the first step toward everything that would come next. But what I didn't know then was this. The hardest part wasn't dreaming. The hardest part was what it would cost me to make that dream real. Because deciding to change your life is one thing. Trying to do it with nothing is something else entirely. The day after I decided to apply for a scholarship abroad, nothing changed. The house was still the same. The silence was still heavy. The struggles didn't pause just because I had a dream. If anything, they became louder, because now I was trying to build something impossible in a place that barely allowed survival. I didn't even know where to start. No laptop, no stable internet, no guidance, just a word I had heard, scholarship. It sounded beautiful, but no one told me how complicated that word really was. Forms, requirements, deadlines, documents I had never even heard of before, personal statements, recommendation letters, academic transcripts, proof of language proficiency. Each requirement felt like a locked door, and I didn't even have the keys to begin opening them. The first time I tried to research online, I remember standing outside a small shop that offered internet services. I didn't go in immediately, because even before I stepped through that door, I was already calculating, how much will it cost? How long can I stay? What if I don't understand anything and waste the money? Dreams, for people like me, always come with a price tag. And sometimes, even trying feels expensive. I finally walked in, sat down, and stared at the screen like it was another world. Because it was. People were applying from places where they had support, guidance, confidence. And there I was, trying to understand everything from scratch. Every click felt like a risk. Every minute felt like money disappearing. Every word I didn't understand felt like proof that maybe this wasn't meant for me. But I stayed, because going back home without trying felt worse than failing. Days turned into weeks. I started learning how to search, how to read requirements, how to write things that sounded professional. But the biggest battle wasn't outside. It was inside me. There were voices. Not loud ones. Quiet ones. Dangerous ones. Who do you think you are? People like you don't go abroad. You're wasting time. What if you fail? And the hardest part, some of those voices didn't come from strangers. They came from people around me. People who didn't mean harm, but had never seen anyone from our situation succeed in that way. So to them, doubt was just realism. At home, things didn't get easier. In fact, they got worse. Because now I was dividing my time, helping at home and chasing something no one could see yet. Sometimes, I felt guilty, like I was being selfish for dreaming while my mother was still struggling just to keep things together. There were nights I sat with my papers and just stared at them. Not writing, not moving, just thinking, is this worth it? But then I would look at my mother, at her tired eyes, at her hands, and something inside me would harden. Not in anger, but in determination. Getting documents became its own battle. Some required money, some required signatures from people who weren't easy to reach. Some required time we didn't have. I walked long distances, waited in lines, and came back empty-handed more times than I can count. There were days I felt like giving up. Not because I was weak, but because the process felt designed for people who already had everything. And then came the personal statement, the paper that was supposed to tell my story, my dreams, my purpose, my future. I sat down to write it, and nothing came out. Because how do you explain a life full of silent struggles to people who have never lived it? How do you put pain into words without sounding broken? How do you speak about hope when you're still fighting to believe in it? I wrote, deleted, cried, and started again. Over and over. Until one night, something shifted. I stopped trying to sound perfect. And I started telling the truth. Not the polished version, not the impressive version, the real one. The girl who had nothing, but refused to stay in. That was the first time I felt powerful. Not because my situation had changed, but because I finally owned my story. When I submitted my first application, my hands were shaking. Not from excitement, but from fear. Because now it was no longer just a dream. It was something I could lose. And the waiting began. Days felt longer. Silence felt louder. Every notification made my heart race. Every rejection, I imagined before it even came. But here's what no one tells you. Chasing a dream when you have nothing doesn't just test your ability. It tests your identity, your belief in yourself, your willingness to continue even when there is no evidence that it will work. And yet, I kept going. Application after application, hope after disappointment, faith after fear, because somewhere deep inside me, that voice was still there, stronger now, clearer, unshaken. This is not where your story ends. But I had no idea that the next chapter would demand even more from me, more strength, more patience, more courage than I had ever needed before. Because applying was only the beginning. Waiting is a strange kind of pain. It doesn't shout, it doesn't break things, it just sits quietly in your chest, and refuses to leave. After submitting my applications, life didn't pause to give me space to hope. Everything continued as normal, the same responsibilities, the same struggles, the same reality. But inside me, something had changed. I was no longer just surviving. I was waiting for an answer that could change everything. Every morning, I woke up with the same thought, maybe today. Every night, I slept with the same question, what if not? I checked my email more times than I could count. Sometimes there was nothing, sometimes there were messages, just not the ones I was hoping for. The first rejection came quietly. No warning, no preparation, just a simple message. Thank you for your application, I didn't need to read the rest. Something inside me dropped, not loudly, not dramatically, Just slowly, like hope slipping through fingers you tried too hard to close. I told myself it was okay. That it was normal. That many people get rejected before they succeed. But the second rejection didn't feel normal. It felt heavier. The third one felt personal. I started questioning everything. My writing, my grades, my story, myself. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe they saw something I didn't. Maybe this was never meant for me. And the worst part, life around me didn't stop to comfort me. At home, things were still hard. There was no space to sit and process emotions, no quiet corner where I could fall apart freely. So I learned to break silently. I smiled during the day. I helped where I was needed. I carried on like nothing was happening. But at night, the doubts were louder. I remember one night in particular. I had just received another rejection. I didn't even open it fully. I already knew. I sat there, holding my phone, staring at the screen long after it had gone dark. And for the first time since I started this journey, I asked myself something I had been avoiding: what if I stop? Not because I didn't want the dream anymore, but because I was tired of fighting for something that kept slipping away. That night felt different, heavier, final. I folded my papers, closed my notebook, and turned away from everything that had once felt like possibility. For a moment, I chose silence over hope. Days passed. I stopped checking my email as often. I stopped talking about applications. I told myself I was being realistic now. But deep inside, that voice was still there. Quieter, but not gone. You didn't come this far to quit like this. I tried to ignore it. Then something happened. One afternoon, while helping at home, my phone buzzed. I almost didn't check it. I had trained myself not to expect anything anymore. But something made me pause. I picked it up slowly, opened the email, and for a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. Because this time, it didn't start the same way. There was no, "We regret to inform you." No polite rejection. No quiet ending. Instead, there were words I had read in my imagination so many times, but never believed I would see for real. Congratulations. My hands started shaking. Not lightly, violently. I read it once, twice, 3 times. Still not believing. I thought maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. But it was real. I had been accepted. Not just accepted, selected. Chosen. Given a full scholarship, tuition, accommodation, even the flight, everything. For a moment, the world around me disappeared. The noise, the struggles, the weight I had carried for years, all of it faded into one overwhelming feeling: this is happening. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just sat there, frozen. Because when something you've dreamed about for so long finally becomes real, it doesn't always feel like joy at first. Sometimes it feels like shock. Then slowly, very slowly, the reality began to settle in. Tears came. Not soft ones. Not quiet ones. The kind that carry years of pain, fear, doubt, and silent prayers. I cried for the girl who almost gave up, for the nights no one saw, for every moment I believed I wasn't enough. My mother noticed. She asked what was wrong. And for once, I didn't have to hide anything. I showed her the message. She read it, then read it again. And in her eyes, I saw something I had never seen before: relief, pride, and hope, all at once. That was the moment it became real, not just for me, but for us. Our story was changing. But here's what no one prepares you for. Getting the opportunity is not the end of the struggle. Sometimes it's the beginning of a new one. Because after the tears, after the excitement, after the disbelief, reality returned with a new question, a harder one, a scarier one. Now that you've been chosen, can you actually make it there? Because acceptance was one thing. But leaving was a whole different battle. Documents, deadlines, pressure, time running faster than I could keep up. And a world I had never stepped into before, waiting on the other side.